Hello, everybody. Christos was Christian. Christ is risen. It's very good to be here today. I had a message, Vladika Irene and I WhatsApp, whatever that is. And so I had a WhatsApp very late last night, and it said, "Where are you?" And I said, I was actually in a cricket club celebrating my equivalent of a daughter-in-law's mother's 60th birthday. "Why aren't you at the conference?" was the next bit back. And I said, "It's my ordeal is tomorrow." So Vladika Rene sends his love to everybody. He's very much looking forward to coming to work in the UK and to be amongst us. It's 90 years ago last week that the Russian Church abroad appointed its first bishop to look after Great Britain and Ireland. Bishop Nicholas was appointed and consecrated a week ago, 90 years ago. And so it's extraordinary that this year the Russian Church will have 2 resident bishops in the UK. We'll have Vladika Matthew and Vladika Irene. And I think it's wonderful. We had a wonderful pilgrimage and there were to St. Albans, and there were many of you there. And Vladika Irene said to me how wonderful it was that so many of us are actually stepping forth, coming out and being seen as Christians in our society, which so many Christians are unseen. But we are stepping forth, we are around, you can see us, and the people of Britain will see us more and more, I think. So Bishop Irene sends his love, and he has released me from the ordeal of giving a talk, and has lumbered my dear friend, Father Mark. So may God bless you. It's really lovely to see you all.
Thank you, Father Paul. Great happiness to have you here with us once again. You still remember your moving talk from last year's conference about the Podvig of the new martyrs and confessors of Russia, and how their prayers have certainly brought us together after all these years. I have to introduce now Father Hieromonk Mark Underwood. Not an easy task because we only made our acquaintance last night in the bar, but never mind. Father Mark is the priest of the parish of the Kazan icon of Most Holy Mother of God in Cardiff, priest of the Diocese of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia in Britain and Ireland. And he's going to talk to us about the Follow for Christ of female saints from the late Russian Empire to the Soviet period.
Your Grace, Bishop Matvey, Reverend Fathers, sisters, friends, I was delighted when His Grace Bishop Irene asked me to attend this conference, though I was rather daunted when our Chancellor, Father Paul, said that I would have to sing for my supper and to stand up and give a talk. However, when he said that the theme of this year's conference was to be Yurodstva, holy foolishness, I quickly warmed to the idea. I have to be honest and say that I stand here not as an academic in any sense of the word, and I come here with no original ideas and with no fruits of learning or of research. I simply come as a parish priest and as a former primary teacher from a quiet corner of Wales. But I do so having been greatly impressed and touched in my Orthodox life by the sanctity of the Holy Fools and their lessons for us in how we can try to live a courageous and authentic Christian life in a very challenging modern world. Growing up in the 1970s, As children, those of us who were children then, if you were like me, were blissfully unaware of the geopolitical tensions of the adult world, of the Cold War and of the ominous expectation behind the trial runs of old air raid sirens that ironically happened in the school playground. Happily, for me at least, there was in our quiet corner of Worcestershire a permeation of Russian culture and history that even reached inside the village primary school, probably through the enthusiasms of teachers who, back in those days, were allowed to say something of what happened in the primary classroom. As we enjoyed Russian tales and legends, ballet and music, and the visual arts, even the odd details of saints' lives and of images of Russian orthodoxy made it through the barriers. And one of the figures that was certainly appealing was Blessed Basil of Moscow. He would have been more appealing, I think, had we had the equivalents of the cartoon that we saw earlier. His wild figure of very obvious appeal to the childish imagination, wandering the streets of Moscow, nearly naked with unkempt hair and a beard, and the entertainment of his wild antics, walking unimpeded into mansions and palaces where he scolded, riddled and raved and was heard and obeyed, and of course was finally carried to his resting place by the most powerful in the land. This was my very, very first introduction to Holy Fools, but it was to be a long time before I encountered any other lives that followed in St. Basil's footsteps in this challenging, uncomfortable, and almost impossible way of holiness. When this encounter did happen, it was as a newly received Orthodox Christian and convert from Anglicanism. And my real introduction to the Holy Fools was to come from a deeply devout and deeply individual and pious daughter of the Russian Orthodox Church, who lived just outside Chesterfield, very close to where we are now. She gave me a book, just a small, thin paperback book, which went through the lives of the Holy Fools, starting with figures that we've heard of today, with Simeon of Emesa, with Isidora of Tabanesi, but then went through, and because holy foolishness is very much a Russian phenomenon, went through the lives of so many holy fools who are very important in the history of the Russian Orthodox Church. I read the book from cover to cover, and it made a great spiritual impression upon me. But there seemed to be one very major absence. Apart from Isidora and Blessed Xenia, the lack of women, and the fact that all of the fools presented in pre-Petrine Russia were men. On a wider level, this absence, of course, is very much a reflection of the dearth of female saints in Russia up to the great age of the Holy Fools, from the 15th to the 17th centuries. Even the briefest glance at lists of the saints of Russia before Peter the Great reveals a lack of recognized women, of recognized female saints. And there is a distinct and obvious social cohesion to those women who were officially canonized and venerated in our church up until that point. If we just scan through the list and read the names: Great Princess Olga, Princess Anna of Novgorod, Yefrosini of Polotsk, Princess Febroni of Murom, Grand Princess Theodosia, Yefrosini of Suzdal, Princess Karatina of Novgorod, Princess Agrippina of Zhev, Venerable Marfa of Pskov, Anna of Kashin, Feodosia of Nizhny Novgorod, Juliana of Vyazma, Grand Princess Yefrosini of Moscow, the theme becomes very obvious. Amongst all of these in the list, we have monastic saints. But even the monastic saints there are princesses. The lowliest poor soul in that list is just a mere noble, just a boyarina. How humble. But before even turning to this absence of female holy fools, we need to reflect that when we read the lives of the fools for Christ's sake, handed down from Russia before the westernizing and secularizing program of the Emperor Peter, we know that in style and language, we are encountering a world in which there was little secular tradition of writing or of the visual arts. In this world with no tradition of secular portraiture, tsars and princes were painted in stylized, formulaic iconographic style. We probably have all seen the iconographic portrait of Tsar Ivan the Terrible. Similarly, the written lives of the saints are not founded on biographical detail and realism. Rather, we are encountering the verbal iconography of hagiography. To enter the lives of the invariably male fools of medieval Russia is to engage with such verbal icons, in which Christian holiness and the grace-filled but unconventional and often confusing and challenging exploits of the Sourozh-TV are described in ritual terms, expressed through hagiographical conventions, in stock actions, and in scenarios that are expected and anticipated in the lives of the authentic holy man. Certain details in these lives serve as a mark and a measure of authenticity, and details from the hagiography of one saint are echoed in another, such as Nikolai Pskov's challenging Ivan the Terrible with a piece of raw meat, symbolizing the Tsar's devouring the flesh of Christians. This is then echoed in the lives of Arseny of Novgorod, Nikolai Kolchanov, and Vasily Blazhenin. In a world in which the icon dominated psycho-spiritual consciousness, whether prince or peasant, educated or illiterate, the visual conventions of the sacred image were transposed into the written word, through which the hagiographies of the saints were transmitted from generation to generation. Like the narrative scenes that we see around the margins of the icons, which show the lives of the saints, the life events of the early holy fools are expressed through stylistic tableaux and sacred patterns. However, this strictness was not to last forever, and by the time we come to the life of Saint Simeon of Yurevitz, biographical detail begins to be woven into the conventions of hagiography. The celebrated life of the old believer leader, the archpriest Avakum, makes biography a new medium in Russia. And by the time we come to the lives of the holy women, the holy fools, starting with Saint Ksenia, we begin to see real people. We begin to learn facts and details about their lives. The sort of details that may have surprised the medieval hagiographer or scribe. The details of Saint Ksenia's life are still quite scant, but we know that Ksenia Grigorievna Petrova was born between 1719 and 1730. We know that she died around 1803, that her late husband, Colonel Andrei Fedorovich Petrov, and of his sudden death without confession and without the holy mysteries, this being the catalyst for her taking on the podvig of holy foolishness. wandering the streets of St. Petersburg, dressed in his coat and wearing his persona for 45 years. However, given the length of her podvig, we know surprisingly little of Blessed Ksenia's life. Though it is striking for us to see the link that this life forges between the saint and the urban arena of her holy foolishness, rooting her in the St. Petersburg that came to love and venerate her. St. Petersburg, significant as a city symbolic of westernization and of the so-called Enlightenment, a city that was the creation of a Tsar who had nothing but disdain for holy foolishness. By the time we come to the series of eldresses and female holy fools, who have their apogee in the Silver Age of Russian culture that coincided with the great monastic revivals of the 19th century, we have a wealth of information describing the backgrounds, the social backgrounds, the early lives of these holy women about whom we've already heard so much. We have records of their words, and records which memorialize their outward foolishness in lively and rich detail. We now begin to be given dates, family data, contemporary descriptions, anecdotes, memories, and real details of the lives of the Blessed Ones. Together with their portraits and their photographs, this allows us to approach them in a deeply personal way, as real people who are very much individuals. If we take the example of Blessed Pelagia Ivanovna, the first of the Holy Fools of Divevo, we have a wealth of biographical detail recorded by those who knew her, including her cell attendant, the nun Anna Gerasimovna, and her spiritual son, the artist Mikhail Petrovich Petrov. We learn of her life before she was blessed by St. Seraphim to take up the podvig of holy foolishness, of her subsequent arrival in the monastery of Divevo. We learn that she was born in Arzamas in October 1809, that her parents were the tanner and merchant Ivan Ivanovich Surin and Paraskeva Ivanovna Bebeshova. We learn that she had two brothers, Andrei and Ivan. We read that her widowed mother remarried the widowed Alexei Nikitich Korolev, a strict man whose 6 children had little or no time or tolerance for Pelagia, who even in childhood had already begun to act foolishly after recovering from a childhood illness. We learn more and more facts about the visit of her future husband, Sergei Vasilievich Serebrennikov, with his godmother, of Pelagia's foolish behaviour to try and dissuade him and to defend herself from an unwanted marriage, spooning tea from the teacup to water the flowers in the design of the fabric of her dress. The naturalism and the realism of this episode, very far from the stylized details of medieval hagiography, lends the life of Blessed Pelagia a tenderness and warmth that is quite distant and distinct from the formalism of what we read in the prologue or in the Minea. We know that the couple married in the church of St. John the Theologian on the 23rd of May 1828, and that this became a period of her life which is a trial and podvig in herself. Once Blessed Pelagia's podvig finds its full expression within the walls of the monastery of Divevo, after her husband and family have renounced her, we continue to have a wealth of contemporary anecdotal detail. Of Blessed Pelagia's successor, Blessed Pasha, or, as we've heard more formally, Praskovia Ivanovna, we learn of her birth into serfdom, of her parents, Ivan and Daria, being owned by the noble Boligin family, who gave her away in marriage, as we've heard, to another serf, Fyodor, and that though happy, the marriage was childless. And as we read the biographical details of these and other female holy fools like her, we meet great social diversity, with the Podvig of holy foolishness, Sourozh-TV, being the spiritual equalizer, allowing princess or serf to be freed from the obligations and chains of their class and origins through ascetical transformation in putting on the humiliated Christ. In the early 19th century, we encounter Princess Evdokia Vyazemskaya, a former maid of honor to the Empress Catherine, reborn as the Holy Fool, Blessed Yefrosini. The lesser nobility is represented by Blessed Domna Karpovna of Tomsk, the merchant classes by Blessed Pelagira Divevo, slavery, serfdom, by Blessed Pasha of Sarov. In holy foolishness, these women find freedom from the strictness of Russian social strata in their slavery for Christ. But taking a step back, the detail we encounter provides personal context to their lives, which lead us from the Russia of Peter the Great and the years that followed in Blessed Xenia, through the false enlightenment of the upper classes with Blessed Yefrosinia in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and the Divevo eldresses and Blessed Feoktista Mikhailovna of Voronezh bridge the end of imperial Russia, bringing us into the years of religious persecution in the Soviet period. And then the likes of Blessed Olga and Blessed Alipia of Kiev, and Lyubov and Pelagia of Ryazan, and Blessed Varenka of Pilna bring us right up to modern times. The details that we have of the female holy fools in the closing years of Imperial Russia and into the Soviet period give us a glimpse of the events and the catalysts that set these women originally on their spiritual path. For some, such as Blessed Pelagia of Divevo and Blessed Lyubov of Ryazan, childhood illness played a central part. In Pelagia's case, we're even given the words of her mother, who said, "At an early age, something strange happened to Pelagia. The girl fell ill, and having lain for days in bed, she got up, not at all looking like herself. From being an exceptionally intelligent child, she turned into some kind of holy fool." Though for Pelagia, the illness was relatively short, for Lyubov of Ryazan, it was a full 15 years of paralysis and immobility that prepared this child for her future podvig. And during this time, we are told that the girl found consolation in prayer and spiritual reading and formed a great devotion to St. Nicholas, who would play his own part in her taking up of the podvig of holy foolishness. For Pelagia, the visit to St. Seraphim with her newly-wed husband was the encounter that set her on the formal path, if we can use the word formal, for holy foolishness. Of course, this wasn't the hoped-for result of the young man, who ironically thought that St. Seraphim would dissuade her from her foolish behaviour, rather than telling her, "Go to my convent, Matushka. Go and don't tarry. Take care of my orphans. Many will be saved through you, and you will be a light for the world." For Blessed Lyubashka, it was St. Nicholas, before whose icon she loved to pray, who appeared to her and told her to stand up, walk, and take upon herself folly for Christ. For others among our holy women, trauma was a catalyst that set them on the path of their difficult struggles. There is a parallel between the life of St. Xenia of St. Petersburg and Blessed Pelagia of Ryazan, through the life-changing and unexpected loss of their husbands. In the well-known life of St. Ksenia, the sudden death of Andrei Fyodorovich whilst drinking and gambling is the turning point. In the case of Blessed Pelagia, her husband went out on business one day and never returned. He was attacked and died of the injuries sustained in this assault. And we are told that Pelagia's sorrow was less that her husband was dead, but more the fact that, like St. Ksenia's husband, he was unable to confess and to commune of the holy mysteries before his death. And of course, this was in an age in which many people only did confess or commune once or twice a year. His funeral marked the end of Blessed Pelagia's old life and the beginning of her podvig. With Blessed Feoktista Mikhailovna of Voronezh, we have no indication that the death of her husband, who was a naval officer, was the traumatic turning point we see in St. Ksenia and Blessed Pelagia of Ryazan. But it did mark the beginning of her wandering life, which was to become characterized by holy foolishness. Conversely, it was the secret flight to escape the prospect of marriage that began the wandering of Blessed Donna Karpovna of Tomsk, who died in 1872. And this escape resulted in her arrest for vagrancy in Poltava and her exile to Siberia, which became the arena of her wandering in holy foolishness. The event that radically changed the early life of Blessed Alipia of Kiev, one of our modern holy fools, came during the Civil War, when her parents were shot by a detachment of Red Army soldiers. And even though this little child was only 8 years old, her initial reaction was to pray for the repose of her parents and to read the Psalter over their newly murdered bodies all night until she was taken to safety by her uncle. And then she soon started wandering between monasteries and shrines, secretly beginning a hidden life of intense prayer and hidden inner struggles. Though the grace of God soon became evident to the faithful people around her, even though her years of holy foolishness lay ahead, far in the future, it was this life of wandering that was to eventually lead her to Kiev, to her secret monastic tonsure and her podvig of folly for Christ, after the second closure of the monastery. And as we look at the lives of these holy fools, we see some key features. One of these features is the freedom from all conventions and expectations. For those around them, this freedom may have been interpreted rather as stubbornness, as madness and rebellion against what was proper and what was correct. Thus, Blessed Pelagia Ivanovna, forcibly married, disregarded not only the marital relationship, but all familial bonds and social conventions. This freedom in Christ enabled her to bear emotional and physical abuse, resisting all attempts on the part of her husband and family to make her to renounce the life of folly for Christ, to which Saint Seraphim had blessed her. However, there is another challenging aspect of Blessed Pelagia's freedom from what we would consider to be the natural bonds of affection and human instinct. And this is her indifference and very intentional disinterest in her newly born sons, Vasily and Ivan, both of whom subsequently died very early in their infancy. It is perhaps difficult for us to understand how the bonds of motherhood could be dissolved, even by the podvig of foolishness for Christ. But this is the shocking and challenging reality that we meet in the life of the Eldres Pelagia and of the other fools for Christ. Even now, their lives at times are challenging and difficult. For us, they are puzzling. The podvig of holy foolishness continues and should continue to shock and to disturb us, reminding us that the individuals we celebrate in this conference are not easy figures. They shouldn't be becoming figures of myth or folklore. We shouldn't cease to be shocked and troubled by them, even as Orthodox Christians, because they challenge us and the conventions of our lives as well as the lives of the outer world. And they continue to challenge not only the ways of the world, but each of us as Christians in our preconceptions and our conventions. Theirs are not easy lives, as the humiliation of kenoticism rejects every aspect of self, of familial and social normality and stability, and every aspect of personal comfort, as the Holy Fall clothes him or herself in the humiliated Christ. For Blessed Pelagia Ivanovna's successor, Blessed Pasha, the freedom she found was, as we've heard, from the bonds of slavery, of serfdom, which she simply refused to acknowledge as having any validity. Blessed Pasha of Sarov, arena in the world, had previously shown exemplary obedience. At the age of 17, she submitted to the will of her master and parents, as we heard yesterday, entering into an arranged marriage in which she was an exemplary wife, winning the admiration of her husband's family, who loved her for her gentleness, industriousness, and piety. However, after her husband's death through tuberculosis, Irina refused coercion to marry, coercion from her new heterodox owners, to whom the noble Buligins had sold the couple. After false accusation and theft and corporal punishment, Irina refused to submit to them, and she absconded, as we've heard, going on pilgrimage to Kiev, an experience that profoundly changed her life and the direction that it took. After her arrest and her return to her owners for a year, she escaped to Kiev again. And after another arrest and forcible return to the Schmidt family, she was thrown out onto the street. And finally, this punishment and disownment, which was meant to shame her, was the thing that finally gave her the outer physical freedom needed for her podvig of holy foolishness, allowing her to return to Kiev, where she received the monastic tonsure. Amongst the lives of these holy women and of all of the holy fools, of course we see a great freedom from possessiveness, that they thought nothing of taking other people's possessions as well, because they didn't believe that possessiveness should apply to anybody else as well as themselves. In times of need, we hear of them taking other people's goods, especially food, and redistributing them to those in need. Blessed Lyubov of Ryazan was free to enter the shop of a rich merchant and take whatever she needed, the owner knowing that he would receive a blessing through this action, and that he would benefit from the Blessed One's visit. Blessed Domna Karpovna equally collected food, with the housewives of Tomsk often discovering that their freshly prepared food, buns, bread, meat, and even kasha still in the pot, had been liberated so that Domna could feed the poor, could feed wanderers, and, very special for her, could feed all of the cats and dogs to which she had a very special bond. Like any Orthodox ascetical labour, podvig, the individual details of holy foolishness as we meet it and as we hear more and more of the lives of these blessed ones are tools with which the passions are battled and vanquished, the human ego subjugated to the mind of Christ. And many of the ascetical acts of the holy women living a life of folly for Christ were very little different to the traditional ascetic labours that we encounter in the lives of monastic saints. For Blessed Euphrosynia of Karpanovo, her podvig was to intentionally live in cramped conditions, surrounded with animals, in an unventilated and purposely unclean cabin. When asked, "Mother, why do you keep such animals? There's such a terrible smell," Blessed Euphrosynia smiled and replied, "It replaces the perfume that I used so much at court." Of course, she had been a maid in honour to the Empress Catherine II. As a podvig, this eldress slept very little and slept on the floors with the dogs when she did get a little rest, often saying, "I am lower than the dogs." Even before meeting Saint Seraphim and entering Devevo, for Pelagia Ivanovna, the podvig of holy foolishness was a feature of the married life that she had no wish to live. She purposely rebelled against all that was expected of her, bringing ridicule on herself by her dress, combining the fine dresses bought for her by her husband with the old dirty rags tied around her head, making herself and, indirectly, her spouse, her husband, a laughing stock in the eyes of the town and its people. Before the unwanted marriage, Blessed Pelagia's life records the words of her undaunted suitor, words which premise the violent turn of her life after the marriage. Her future husband said, "She's not stupid. She just needs someone to teach her. That's the way she is. I will teach her myself." Of course, we cannot know the intention of these words that are put in his mouth, but they contain a potential menace. And the unfolding methods of his teaching reveals details of her life and of that age that are disturbing for us. Revisiting this life after not having read it for quite a few years, I was very much struck by the violence and the brutality of Blessed Pelagia's surroundings, of familial and social insensitivity to physical suffering, and the violence that the Blessed One faces from her husband and from her own family. In her essay, Between Law and Morality, Violence Against Women in 19th Century Russia, Mariana Moravieva writes, "Cases of marital abuse, besides regular battering, often included harnessing a woman to a cart, or tying her up to a horse and riding around for several miles, or beating her with a horsewhip or a knout. Justification for the punishment varied, but basically included the wife's disobedience, refusal to live with her spouse, usually involving escape to her parents or another village, or more often, no justification was needed." These words could have been written very much just for Blessed Pelagia Ivanovna and the course of her life. Despite changes in the law to protect women, husbands were often acquitted if they could bring evidence that their wives had provoked them. No doubt this was the attitude of the local authorities to the husband of Blessed Pelagia Ivanovna, who was unable to dissuade his wife from her podvig of holy foolishness. In the eyes of the husband, his family, Blessed Pelagia's family, and those in authority, she was flouting her duty to submit to her husband and bringing shame upon him. Blessed Pelagia's life records that Sergei Vasilyevich not only chained and beat his wife, as we've heard, starved and imprisoned her, but also dragged her to the authorities and asked for his unsubmissive wife to be whipped. Her life tells us the mayor, in order to please husband and mother, ordered her to be tied to a bench and punished her so cruelly that those present who had requested the punishment, her mother included, trembled and froze with horror, as she herself later related. Her body was torn to shreds, and blood was running all over the room. For Pelagia, all of this was to be endured for the sake of Christ, and for the podvig of holy foolishness for him. When she was finally disowned and found shelter in Divevo, she continued to silently suffer the acts of others as part of this podvig, but also assumed traditional ascetic feats, useless and meaningless in the eyes of the world. We are told that when the Blessed One arrived in Divevo, she immediately began running around the monastery, where she self-harmed, beating her head and hands against the walls. This is not the only detail of self-harming in her life. She purposely stood on nails. And this sort of detail is difficult and painful, not fitting neatly into the expectations of hagiography, and certainly not fitting neatly into our expectations of the way the saints behave. Mikhail Petrov recorded that Pelagia kept and wore the chains with which her husband had imprisoned her. And, like her beloved Saint Seraphim, she dragged stones around and filled her cell with them, as she collected more and more. Useless to onlookers, the stones became a weapon with which to wear out the flesh. To these she added bricks that were left in the fire that destroyed neighbouring accommodation, but these will be returned to in considering prayer. Like Blessed Yefrosinia, she slept on the floor and purposely positioned herself so that others would have to step over her. When we consider the appearance of the holy fools, of these blessed ones, in their mode of dress, they often added details that purposely made movement and merely being clothed uncomfortable, an act of mortification and a podvig in itself. In the life of Blessed Domna of Tomsk, which was printed in 1897, we read, her clothing was very strange. It would consist almost entirely of different sizes of bundles, tied and hanging together on her almost completely naked body. In these bundles would be worthless rags, old bast, strings, straps, footwear, broken glass, stones, sawdust, and much else. On top of these bundles, which she wore, would be many small bags with bread, tea, sugar, incense, candles, sauerkraut. Her brief biography tells us that all of these bundles and bags are aptly referred to as clothing chains, which, to quote her life, in their plentifulness weighed a great detail, constituted an ascetic labour to wear constantly. Yet they did not in the least save her from cold, wind, rain and snow, since there was always sufficient space between the bundles for them to penetrate. Further to the podvig and physical discomfort of his strange covering, the many bags also had a spiritual purpose, since it was obvious that the bundles served her as prayer robes. Blessed Feoktista Mikhailovna was rather more conventional. We have a description of her from the Nunc